Today I want to talk about 4 periods of Christianization. The first period is the period of proto-Christianization. This is prior to the birth of Christ. And this is a period in which the Greco-Roman world is moving toward a monotheistic view. It's with Platonism, the concept of ideal forms, moving past superficial superstition. And this proto-Christianization phase actually is quite long if you look at the breadth and depth. And the reason for that is probably because Greek philosophy, to a great extent, and Hellenism influenced the development of Christianity. Of course, before the Romans conquered Judea, it was the Greeks with Alexander the Great. And so the concept of anti-astrology, for example, was something that Alexander the Great was being counseled in by the Greek rationalists of that time. They were saying, Alexander, don't follow these astrologers. They don't know what they're talking about. We need to be empirical. So the concept of rationalism, empiricism, getting rid of superstition, getting rid of idols, right? Just focusing on the philosophic ideal, stripping away, those materialistic manifestations, the aesthetic tradition, Asherah idols, totem poles, that sort of thing. So there was a long history in Greco-Roman civilization that you could call the proto-Christian period, in which there was sometimes an esoteric monotheism, sometimes an occult or hidden monotheism, or monism as it's sometimes called. In any case, there was this pre-Christian concept of monism or monotheism that opposed or acted as the head of polytheism, that if you move up the polytheistic religion enough, you'll see that the archetypes and symbols are merely meant to lead you toward monotheism, right? So that's one interpretation, and that and you can see that manifest in Egypt, and you can see that manifest, I think it's with Akhenaten in the sun cult, and then also Zeus is somewhat, there's a monolatry forming around Zeus. So it's a sort of a parallel development to what we see in Semitic religion with the emergence of Judaism versus the Greco-Roman world then emerging with Christ as the monolatric God. So that's the proto-Christian period. Then, of course, you have the early Christian period, birth of Christ, early Christianity. Then you have what I would call the inflection point of Christianity, where Christianity is no longer an oppressed minority, but it's clearly the dominant institution in society, and paganism is on a rapid decline. So if you have a proto-Christian period, an ambiguous period, that could probably be split up into several periods, looking at the different, the progress of Akhenaten then to Greece and so on and so forth. But if you want to look at the first Christian period being the early Christian, the second Christian period probably beginning in the 6th century, that's the inflection point where Christianity is dominant and paganism is being extinguished pretty much everywhere except in very northern Europe, where paganism holds on until about the 11th century. Now, the 11th century is also what I would call the third period of Christianization. You have the proto-Christian period, which maybe you could, depending on your scoring system, you could call that the first, in which there would be 5 phases. But a proto-Christian period, birth of Christ, 6th century, dominance, so we're up to the 3rd stage. And then we get to the 4th stage, which is basically I look at the investiture contest. So from about 500 AD to 1000 AD, there was a stability in Christianity where the head of the Christian church in each kingdom was the king, right? The king was the head of the church. And that reflected traditional European spirituality, where the chieftain was a spiritual role. The chieftain, or you can take a look at the Roman Empire there, the Caesar was a king. He was a god king. He had a religious status in the Roman religion, right? So Of course, there was a separate warrior class, a separate priest class. They're different psychological types. But still, the warrior class and the king and the Caesar had ultimate authority over religious matters, basically, that the priests were subject to him, that it was a warrior-dominant society with the priest class subjugated to the warrior class. And in the 11th century, this starts to change with the investiture contest, where you have the Holy Roman Emperor says, I want to appoint my own bishops, and the papacy is undergoing this internal reformation. When we talk about the Protestant Reformation, we have to understand that that wasn't the first Reformation. There were many prior Reformations, and the 11th century was a huge age of Reformation where the church said we need to purify, we need to go back to principles, we need separation of church and state. Now, this is not something initially, early Christianity, of course, did have a degree of separation between church and state simply because the state oppressed the church. And that is how a lot of these Christian reformers in the 11th century saw themselves, as we need to get back to early Christianity where it's the state versus the church. Of course, that's not how Christianity became codified in the 6th century. In that early, again, which we might call the second Christianization period, leaving aside the proto-Christian period, the second Christianization period is not state versus church, but it's the state with the church codified together. Charlemagne is declared the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, and so basically the necessity of legitimacy, or there's this codependent legitimacy where the church legitimizes the holiness of the kings, and then the kings codify a role for the church. They give the church various properties and lands and their own sphere of influence, but they're codependent, clearly codependent. The 11th century sees a split between the church and the warrior class, the church and the quote-unquote secular state. So it's the secular versus the temporal. And this is, again, it's a new concept in Germanic life. And I reference the Germans because, you know, the Normans, the Franks, the, you know, Holy Roman Empire, Italy, with the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, and in Spain, again, these are Visigothic lines, Visigothic lineages, or Ostrogothic, or whichever Gothic it was. These are all Germanic lines and Germanic ancestries and Germanic heritages of the people who are the chief lawmakers. So in the Germanic tradition, you always have a unity and a codependence between the life of the warrior and the spiritual life. And the Catholic Church, the papacy, says, no, there's a separation between the secular and the spiritual. There's a separation between the temporal and the spiritual. And we need to recognize that, and actually the king is no higher than the lowest priest. And I think at that time, the lowest priest, there were different rankings of priests, and the lowest priest was considered to be an exorcist, which is kind of strange today to think of it in that way, but there were different levels of priests, and the lowest priest would be an exorcist. And so they said, well, the king has a sort of a spiritual status, because they didn't want to contradict all of Christian tradition up to that point. But they said, well, he has a spiritual status, but it's equal to an exorcist. In actual and spiritual terms, a bishop is much higher than the king, so there's no way that he could possibly appoint bishops. This investiture contest led to the rise of popes and anti-popes and warfare and all sorts of dramatic events. But it set a precedent, it set the ball rolling toward what I would call the third big Christianization period. The first one being birth of Christ, second one being basically the establishment of Constantinople, and the third one being this investiture contest. This was not a schism in the terms of Orthodoxy versus the West, although that schism did come around that time, the split between East and West. But this was an important thing. That was not a schism between two churches, ultimately, although it could have gone that way, and certainly there is a foreshadowing of the Protestant Reformation. But what happens here is there is a split between the secular and the temporal, or the secular and the spiritual, that you don't see prior to this. Prior to this, they're very much united. So there's a period of state versus church disunity, a period of state and church unity, and now with the third Christianization period, there's a state opposition to the church, separation of church and state. New concept, new formulation. What's interesting is, if we call this the third Christianization period, the fourth Christianization period is then the Protestant Reformation. Now, what's interesting about the Protestant Reformation is the Protestant Reformation is in some ways a reverse of the investiture contest. The investiture contest was a Germanic king trying to defend his traditional right as the spiritual head of the church, because that's how Germanic law had worked for thousands of years. Now, these papists who wanted to promote this concept of an early church as fighting the state, and they romanticized that, they were, in reality, these people were sort of, you know, if we want to think of the terms Protestant or puritanical, these people were trying to go back to the early church, and they were rejecting the tradition of the Germanic kings. So Protestantism generally is this Reformation that did reject a lot of Catholic tradition. However, there is another ethnic dynamic to it, where obviously Protestantism formulates itself as a Germanic religion, as a Northern European religion, as opposed to Southern Europe. So even there's this kind of inversion that goes on, where in the 11th century, it is the Germans, or the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic kings, that are the defenders of Germanic tradition, and the papists, who are the reformers. They're trying to go back to the original early Christian period, church versus state. But then by the 16th century, with the Protestant Reformation, what you finally have emerging is actually the Germans and the Germanic sphere of Europe, Northern Europe. This is the sphere that is saying, no, we need to go back to the early church. We need to reject Catholic tradition, sola scriptura. We need to be just focused on the Bible. Whereas the Catholic southern areas of Europe, they're saying, no, we need to preserve the traditions, preserve aesthetics, preserve icons, which the Protestants call idols. So there is a complete inversion of which side is which. Nonetheless, the ethnic lines are still there, and Northern Europeans perceive Protestantism as their religion. It is their Germanic religion which separates them from the Southern Europeans. Now, that's there's a political dimension to that, an ethnic dimension, a racial dimension. There are all kinds of these implicit dimensions, even though explicitly it's all about doctrine, it's all about this and that and the other, but a lot of it had to do with the warrior princes of Northern Europe wanting separation from the priestly class of Southern Europe, which they did not think had the right to rule over them. And you see a parallel thing happening with Henry VIII in England, which I would, most people say that's part of the overall Protestant revolution that was happening at the time. So again, to recap, we have birth of Christ as the first period, the second period being Emperor Constantine, the third period being the investiture contest, and the fourth period being the Protestant Reformation. Now, what's interesting about each of these periods, the first period of Christianization, birth of Christ, produces the Roman Empire. These sort of events coincide, that Rome transitions from a republic to an empire right around the time, a little bit before and a little bit after Christianization. So these two periods coincide. The other big transition that happens in the second period is Constantine. That's a huge political shift for Europe to make from being the Rome-centered Roman Empire to now Byzantium, and that leads to a split between East and West. And of course leads to the fall of what we know as the Roman Empire. Even though the Byzantine Empire thinks of itself as the Roman Empire, there's clearly a difference. Clearly a Germanic takeover of Europe. So first Christianization period is the imperialization of Rome. The second is the Germanization of Rome. And the third, being the investiture contest, actually leads to something called the 12th century Renaissance, which is basically a revolution in not just religious thought, but it sets up the concept of a university system, the cathedral system. It changes the concept of categorization. Everything with nominalism, everything has to be categorized. And this leads to, eventually, down the line, someone like Carl Linnaeus, the nomenclature, binomial nomenclature, categorizing living things and science as we know it, academia as we know it. A lot of this is invented in the 12th century Renaissance. Not to say that it didn't have precedence in earlier, Greco-Roman systems, but these had been lost and they were brought back in the 12th century. That's why it's called the Renaissance. It wasn't all invented then, but it was brought back. Now, the Protestant Reformation being the fourth period of Christianization, this brings along with it, you have the Renaissance proper, just prior to it, and then you have 1492, discovery of the Americas. You have, at the same time, the beginnings of an industrial revolution. So all of this stuff is going on. I've also made a video about Rudolph II. And the religion of Rudolph II was not Judaism. It wasn't Catholicism. It wasn't Protestantism. But he had this esoteric, occultist, alchemist outlook. Now, that religion, as being the religion of the Northern European elites, how far back can we trace that? Well, the alchemists themselves like to trace their traditions back to Babylon or Egypt or some pre-Greco-Roman origin. But when we look at this clearly, by the time of Constantine, European elites generally are Christian with older traditions sort of hanging on, vestigial traditions. There's a syncretism going on, Germanic Christianity or Germanized Christianity. And then by the investiture contest, there is very much, again, this thorough second Christianization of Europe. Those conflicts now between the ancient traditions of the German kings and these new reformers in the church. And so I would say the investiture contest really begins the period in which there comes to be a class of European elites who see themselves as hostile to Christianity, or at least Christianity as envisioned by the papacy. And so this is really when, if we want to trace the dynamic between, like a conflict between Jesuits and Freemasons, I would go back to the investiture contest. I would say this is really where it starts, this is where it begins, in that you have these German kings who see their power being stripped from them by the papacy. They see this conflict, and they start to become anti-papal, and they start to reconnect with what they perceive as their alchemical roots. Now, you can question the veracity of the alchemical tradition, but I'm just saying that this was their perspective. They were fighting the papacy by going back to alchemy. And they start to promote alchemy. They start to promote, not all at once, it's a very slow process. It's something you can look at Giordano Bruno. Bruno being an early quote-unquote heretic in the church. And Bruno was someone who promoted racialism. He promoted the idea that there must be a polygenic origin of human species, because there's no way that a Jew and an Ethiopian could be of the same bloodline. They had to be completely separate bloodlines. So you had people like Bruno. Of course, later we have other heretics in the fourth Christianization period, like Galileo, Copernicus, Tycho Brahe. Apparently you say Brahe, not Brahe. But you have all these scientific figures coming out being heretical. But the tradition of heresy, or the tradition of heretical thought, doesn't start with the scientists, it starts with the alchemists. Isaac Newton's another guy who was a scientist and he was an alchemist. So you can see a lot of the unity there between the two traditions of science and alchemy. Alchemy is a heretical movement. It is the esoteric occult religion of European elites that forms, again, following the investiture contest. Germanic elites realize that Christianity is no longer something they can personally dominate, and so now they start to become more interested in the concept of alchemy. Rudolph II, another guy very interested in alchemy, not really a Christian guy. Now, these people were not necessarily anti-Christian, that they appreciated the concept of Christendom in the same way that, white nationalists appreciate the concept of Christendom, even if they might be pagan or heathen or whatever. So this tradition of saying, yeah, we're like culturally Christian, or we like Christendom, we want unity between Christians, but being esoteric and occult and following in this tradition of alchemy, it's a very old thing. And so how far back can we trace these people? Well, again, I say you start with the investiture contest and you look at these little heretical sects, these little forays into alchemy. You look at a lot of alchemical texts and a lot of what alchemists draw upon. They say that it begins somewhere between the 11th century and the 15th century. But when it really takes off, becomes formalized and more exoteric and more present in the culture, and it's not so hidden anymore, the Protestant Reformation does, because of the introduction of religious tolerance, which is sort of another political innovation that happens. First you have separation of church and state, but there's only one church and one state. Now you have religious tolerance, and so that allows for alchemy to not just be a hidden, secret, orally transmitted tradition, but now it's out in the open, it's published, it's in books, you can buy books, look at books, and the top monarchs of Europe, like Rudolf II, are openly sort of looking into alchemy, practicing alchemy, sponsoring alchemists. If you look at the works of Shakespeare, Shakespeare is a Christian author, but if you actually if you read Shakespeare, he talks about Jupiter, and he talks about pagan gods, and he talks about alchemy, right? So Shakespeare's Christian, but he's also part of the elite alchemical tradition of Europe. So there's really these two religious traditions that are going on here, and after the fourth Christianization period, that Protestant Reformation, the introduction of religious tolerance, the opening up of alchemy, when alchemy becomes a tolerated thing, de facto, that is what gives rise to a scientific revolution. First, it's the shift from astrology to astronomy. That's an important one. When the study of the stars starts as this esoteric tradition, and then it becomes exoteric, and it becomes categorized, and it becomes very exact and scientific. That's a huge shift that happens, that then leads to the rise of empiricism, and then leads eventually to the Industrial Revolution. Now, we've gone through these four periods, and today I would say we are in a time of transition. We're reaching a fifth period. Is this a fifth period of Christianization? I would argue no. We are now entering a de-Christianization period. Just as Spangler looked at the rise and fall of empires, we can look at the rise and fall of the Christian framework, that there was a proto-Christian period, there was a beginning, there was a sort of the birth of Christ being the birth of Christianity, Emperor Constantine being the adolescence of Christianity, the growth of Christianity, the investiture contest being the stormy, angsty teenage years of Christianity entering into young adulthood, the Protestant Reformation being the height of Christianity, the peak of Christianity, and since that peak, Christianity has been declining slowly but surely. We still have people who obviously Christianity is alive. It's a living thing. It's an organic like a system that exists, but it's in its old age and it's declining, and we're reaching a fifth period, which is the death of Christianity, the end of Christianity. And whether Christianity disappears entirely, I don't think that's going to happen. I think in the same way that Christianity had a proto-Christian period, Christianity itself is going to be a proto-religion that gives rise to whatever comes next. And if it calls itself Christianity, fine, then we're going to call this the fifth transition period of Christianization. But if it doesn't call itself Christianization, if it doesn't call itself Christianity, whatever that is, I mean, there have been several attempts. Scientology, I would give as an example. Vedanta, I would give as an example. There are all kinds of, I'm trying to think of the one that's in Iran. The Baha'i faith is sort of an example of something that says Christianity is part of our tradition, but we're something fundamentally different, or we're the summation of all these things. So I think we're headed toward some sort of perennialism, some sort of globalism. So that is the 5 stages of Christianization, 6 if you count proto-Christianity. I hope that wasn't too confusing. I hope it was pretty easy to understand. And thank you for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.